the top of their head. And I think you'll find the same thing with a lot of Muslims. When you know, this is a confrontational way of spreading it, which is not what Paul did, spreading the gospel and saying, well, what does the Quran say about someone who refuses to follow Allah? What is that? What do they say? Well, you're to kill them. Call the infidels. Will a Muslim tell you that? Does a Muslim know that? That's what the Quran says. So it opens up opportunities for discussions, and I would recommend that you go into that right away. But you know, that's where the rubber meets the road. You know, Paul or Pastor had talked about a Muslim who was saved because he couldn't believe that a God could love someone that is a sinner, that is so wicked, that they could change and be changed forever by Jesus Christ.
Also, with the
and forgiven.
Originally, their religion was spread from the Middle East throughout North Africa and the surrounding regions through conquest.
Right.
It wasn't spread through peaceful evangelism.
Through war. Yeah.
Spread through war,
Yeah.
by force.
Right.
Eventually, people that were forcibly converted, eventually, even if they didn't get it, they acted like they got it, and the generations after that kind of took it as their own personal faith.
Yeah. Fear-based religion.
Yeah.
Acts 17, 22 and 23, Paul stood in the middle of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that you are extremely religious in every aspect. For as I was passing through and observing objects of your worship, I even saw an altar which was inscribed to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this is what I proclaim to you." That worship in ignorance is something that I wanted to cover a little bit too. There are people in church all over the United States that worship in ignorance because they are lost. They don't know Christ. But they'll raise their hands as if they do. They'll sing. They'll get very spiritual, you know. Some may even speak in tongues. They might get very emotional, and they may fall on the ground, and they may roll around, and may cry. But they're worshiping in ignorance because they don't know Christ. They don't know the fact that he died for them and rose again so that they can have life, have it more abundantly, and have eternal life with him as well. What they know is they've got an emotional experience when they come to church. And when they leave church, they feel good. They feel good. I used to be in this boat. I felt good because I went to church. I did my duty. You know, I went to church. I felt good because I went to church, not because of who died for it. Page 113, Paul sought to find common ground as a means to share the gospel, and then he looked for a way to turn the conversation into a gospel conversation. Let's look at the following conversation starters and explain how you would turn it into a gospel conversation. Well, for the sake of time, let's just look at some of these questions here. So how did you get here? Tell me your story. A way that you can start a conversation with somebody who may be from another state or another country. What's been the most difficult thing that you've gone through in your life, or how did you learn from that experience? Obviously, many people have been through the heartache of death. That might be one of the most difficult things that people go through. And it's pretty easy to turn that conversation into a spiritual conversation. What role did religion or church have in your life growing up? Would you describe yourself as spiritual? Why or why not? Or what kinds of things give your life meaning or purpose? I know some of the sharing fear without Jesus that we had many, many, many years ago in here. It talked about, there was a question, do you have any spiritual beliefs? Would be one of the questions. Or if Jesus was the only way to heaven, would you want to know about that? Why or why not? If there was only one way to heaven, would you want to know more about that? Kind of a prying question as to whether or not you can go any farther, how open they are to your question, that type of thing. Anybody else got any conversation starters that might turn into a witnessing conversation?
Probably not events that's coming up in church.
Yeah, that's a good one.
To a concert.
Right, invite them to a concert.
You don't have to start off with, are you saved?
Right,
Just
right,
a conversation, just get,
right.
talk.
Yeah,
I usually, when I meet somebody, I don't usually directly evangelize. I usually let it be known that I am a Christian. And after I make that statement, I don't, shut down my throats, and then I kind of show by example. You know what I mean?
right,
And then after hanging out with them for a while, all the time in church, or that's when I kind of start evangelizing, I don't just, directly go, full head on, and that's kind of also with me, that's kind of like, I guess, out of my comfort zone, to kind of full blown just start conversations like that. I like to get to know people before
Right.
I have conversations like that.
right. Yeah, yeah, it's hard to quote unquote cold call someone and ask them if they know Jesus is their Savior right on their doorstep.
Yeah.
Like John said, you can invite them to church, when they're out in their yard next door or whatever, say, hey, there's a concert in our church, would you like to come next weekend, or, that type of thing.
But I've also met some really, really bold Christians that extremely bold, that will go hard and just sit there and bam, like preach the gospel to almost successfully to anyone that just kind of walks by, and that just sounds to me it's truly a gift that I could say I don't have.
Yeah, some people have the gift of evangelism. They're evangelistic Christians. They might not be an evangelistic preacher, but they're an evangelistic Christian that are bold like that. My brother-in-law, who's been in church, been saved for many, many years, says that he lived a hellion type of a life before he met Christ. But he remembers in his life distinctly three times that he was witnessed to. And so, it doesn't always happen on the first time. You're not always meant to be reaping the benefits of seeing someone saved, but you may be just a seed sower. And, I believe that a lot of people that are bold like that are seed sowers. They probably won't get someone to come to Christ by being in their face, but they will make an impression and they'll leave a memory for that person on down the road that may hear the same thing.
Well, I think that's why prayer is so important. As you started at the beginning of the lesson about that lady that prayed, that she could witness to someone today, and then all of a sudden she was trying to read a book, and this lady was bothering her. It's like, light bulb, this is who God sent me to talk to about him today.
Right.
And I'm finding it as a, annoyance.
Right.
When this is an answer to my prayer.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think prayer is really important. And then when the prayer is answered, and someone comes in your path, then just let the Lord lead you. And just remember where you came from. You were at one time
mindful, be cognizant of the situation that you're in. And remember what you just prayed. Because, sometimes we forget. We don't have a real long memory. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "But in your hearts regard Christ as Lord, Christ the Lord as holy, ready at any time to give a defense to anyone who asks you the reason for the hope that is in you." So, that's telling our story, right? When someone sees a light in us, maybe in a dark situation, and they want to know, how can you be so joyous in the middle of all the chaos that's going on in our land? Or, why do you have any hope at all? And we need to be ready to tell our story, tell our salvation story.
That's the problem nowadays, is so many Christians don't show that.
Mm-hmm.
They're sick of the mud. They're walking around with ground on their face all the time.
Mm-hmm.
God tells us to show your joy, show the joy that He gives you.
Right.
Have a smile on your face. Say hello to people.
Yeah.
That's a good start, because people at a point will say, "Why are you always so happy?
Yeah.
Why are you always smiling? Why are you always..." I'm not saying you're perfect all the time, but
Right.
get it in your mind to reach out to people.
Yeah.
At least just say hi, open a door, wave somebody on at the stop sign.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't know where it's going to go.
Spread the joy
Yep.
that you have. And then be ready to let people know why
Yeah.
you are so joyful.
If you're around enough, they will ask.
They will ask,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. What are some barriers that we might have to sharing the gospel on page 114? As Paul engaged in the Athenians, he looked for an open door to draw them into conversation. He acknowledged that they were religious, knowing full well that their religion had nothing to do with the one true God. Yet that point of commonality was a springboard for him to talk about what they didn't know. That springboard he's talking about was spirituality and what they didn't know about Jesus. They didn't even believe in one God, but the apostle was actively looking for some way to connect with the people around him. Notice some of the verbs in verses 22 and 23. I see, I was observing, I even found, and he found the connection. They worshiped, and so did Paul. He found a common ground in their spirituality. Granted, they were worshiping the wrong things, but at least they were spiritual seekers. So Paul used this to connect with them. By building an altar and inscribing it to an unknown God, the Athenians clearly were attempting to make sure that they didn't unintentionally forget and thereby risk offending one of the gods. Paul used their acknowledgement that he could acknowledgement that there could be a God that they didn't know was an opening to introduce them to the God who made the world and everything in it. He was saying that inscription that you have, that idol that you have, that stone that you have to the unknown God, that's the God I want to talk to you about today, is what he was saying.
They wanted to worship a God, he was trying to point to the one that he worshiped.
To the God, right. And they acknowledged themselves that there may have been a God they didn't know about. And Paul was saying, the God that you don't know about is the God I'm telling you about today.
That's the perfect interpretation.
Yep, the one true God. Paul told them that they didn't know about the Lord of heaven and earth and his plan to save them. Though we may think that people aren't open to hear the gospel, they often are willing to discuss spiritual matters when we want to point to, we start with a point of commonality which places both parties on equal ground. To be clear, our different beliefs are not equal, but as followers of Christ, we never should approach the conversation with an air of superiority. I think that's really important that we don't do that because, people are easily offended today. I mean, they're more easily offended today than any time in history that I can even remember. So if you point to their sin or say, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't dress like that, you shouldn't talk like that, you know, that's going to offend them and it's going to draw you further away from them. What you got to do is find a commonality. Well, how do you worship? What do you worship? You know, what do you believe? You know, someone may believe in Eastern mysticism or something like that. Well, tell me more about that. What about that attracts you to that religion? You know? Instead of saying, well, you know, there's only one true God, and that's Jesus Christ, and without him you're going to hell. That's going to push people away. Instead, we should humble ourselves and seek those places of connection as an opening to share God's important message of truth. Begin to look and listen for common ground, concerns that people talk about, the team logo they wear, the religious symbols that they display. Any and all of these can be a conversation starter that leads to discussions about the gospel. So let's talk about some bridges to sharing the gospel in our culture. We know that calling attention to sin is going to cause a divide, right? We're not going to be able to call people to Christ or show them God's love by just throwing a sin right in their face. So we build bridges by common things that they, a piece of jewelry that they may have, or maybe they're wearing some type of a piece of clothing that might tell you what type of a religion they are. And talk to them about that kind of stuff. Why do you wear that cross that has Jesus still on it? Well, what do you mean, still on? Well, you know, he got up from the dead. He rose from the dead. The cross that I would wear would be one that doesn't have Jesus Lincoln. Stuff like that. You know, what is the purpose of that particular piece of jewelry to you? What does that mean? Acts 17:30 and 31. John, can you read that, please?
Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God now commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has set the day when he is going to judge the world with righteousness by the man he has appointed. He has provided proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead.
Thanks. It's great to go where people are and get involved with what they're doing. It's great to ask questions and start discussions. But it doesn't end there. To stop there is like walking away from the marathon just short of the finish line. We must get to the truth of what Jesus did to make a relationship with God possible. As Paul spoke to the Athenians at the Areopagus, he framed the message in terms of that were familiar to his listeners. He quoted their poets and he spoke their language. But he still got down to the gospel. The Athenians struggled to accept God as creator and judge and to believe in Jesus' resurrection. But on these points, Paul did not compromise the truth. So you may run into the same thing today, right? People don't accept the fact that, number one, Jesus is God, and number two, that he is a judge. You know, yes, he loves everyone. Yes, he is love. But he's also a judge, and people don't like to believe that. But you still have to tell them the truth, right? Even though it might be an unpopular truth. What Paul did is that he could make the truth clear to the Athenians. When he mentioned the resurrection of Jesus, he was stopped by some in the crowd. He even ridiculed him. Some even ridiculed him, but Paul's witness was not in vain. Others wanted to know more. We can be fairly confident that Paul found another opportunity to continue his explanation of the gospel with those that wanted to know more. You know, we might concentrate too much on the people who slam a door in our face, or people who ridicule us, or people that just don't want to know anything about God. But we can't ignore that there's other people listening to the conversation that may want to know more. People that seek to know the truth. And that's who we need to concentrate on. And we can't ignore those people that are seeking the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Responding to the gospel requires that we acknowledge the sin that separates us from God. We need to accept that a price had to be paid for the sins that we committed. This leads us to recognize that Jesus was the only acceptable sacrifice for our sin. Finally, we need to understand that Jesus became our substitute so that we can be brought into a relationship with God. Jesus freed us from a deadly debt. And that is amazingly good news. Again, leading people through the law. Have you ever looked at a woman with lust? Have you ever stolen anything? Have you even thought about stealing something? Well, you've broken God's law, and once you break one of God's laws, you've broken them all, and there's no hope for you except for Jesus Christ. He is the bridge. He is the bridge builder. He brings us back to God. Paul met the Athenians on their ground and brought the truth of Jesus into the conversation and crossed the finish line in communicating the gospel. The results would be up to God, and we can do the same in our own encounters. So to tie this up, things that you can do this week to prepare yourself to share the gospel with someone. You can open your heart, you can pray first, and ask God to make you aware of opportunities around you to talk about your faith, to pray for a willingness to share Christ with others, to open your eyes, to make a list of areas that interest you to share with other people. With the list, identify ways those areas of interest could be used to turn a conversation to the gospel. And then just open your mouth. Be diligent about maximizing your windows of opportunity to share Christ. Be intentional in making natural bridges between you and another person to talk about the gospel. It's easy to get busy and even so focused on the good things that we lose awareness of the people that God is bringing across our paths. But just as Paul sees this opportunity, so must we, if the message of the gospel is to be spread to all those that need to hear it. So just take this with you. Look for openings. Look for areas that you may be, that people may be spiritual, and talk to them about their spirituality and find out about their beliefs. And like Alex said, kind of get to know them first, so that eventually you can share the gospel with them like the great Paul did. So appreciate you coming out today. Next week I'll be gone, but the week following we'll be into Revelation. We'll be in a 6-week study in Revelation, and after that we'll be in the Old Testament. It'll be a 6-week study in I believe, 1 Kings, I believe. Thank you. Appreciate you coming out.
Thank you.